Okay, well, welcome back to Apologetics. We're working through the semester, and this is where we're at on our class outline, just to kind of help us keep on track and know where we're going, what we've covered, and so on and so forth. We're still in the first section, so I'll zoom in now to this section that we're focusing on the first few weeks here, and that is on the existence of God, providing good reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God, there is a supreme being out there. And these are arguments, these are things that, all theists can rally around, so to speak. So not only Christians, Muslims, Jews, anybody who believes that there is a supreme being. Aristotle, as we've seen, Plato would and have rallied around these arguments. As I've said before, these arguments can be found all throughout history in different separated people groups developing a belief in a supreme being through the same thought process, thinking through these things and coming to these similar arguments. Well, tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. Tonight we're actually going to look at the most powerful argument against the existence of God. And that is, of course, the problem of evil. Now, even if somebody doesn't reject God because of this, I would venture to say that we all struggle with it, at least at some point in our lives, this problem of evil. That if there is this all-powerful, all-good God out there somewhere, then why is there so much pain, suffering, evil in this world? Before we jump into the details, I just want to make a little word of warning here that there's a right time and a wrong time to discuss the problem of evil. So you might have encountered situations where somebody is really struggling with evil and suffering in the world, but it's mostly because of an experience that they've had in their own lives. Maybe they've been abused, maybe they were hurt even by somebody in the church. So they've gone through a horrendous experience and they're really struggling with that at a deep personal level. Well, if you're working with somebody, if you're trying to love somebody in a situation like that, that's not the right time to pull out your solution to the problem of evil, okay? In a situation like that, you want to love the person, cry with the person, pray to God with the person, and not be there trying to have all the answers, right? However, there are certain times, though, where we can maybe try to step back from our own personal experiences and evaluate this issue more objectively, or as objectively as we can, as finite creatures. In fact, it's probably best that we think through this issue preferably before we encounter or before we run into a terrible experience in our own life, so that we're prepared for it. So one of my motivations to cover this topic, besides it being part of the class, is to help those, especially as I teach this to young people, to help them think through this issue before they experience a terrible pain or suffering in their own lives, so they have some tools, at least rationally, to process it. Okay? There's a lot of good resources out there, of course, dealing with this issue at a more emotional level. Here's one of them by Philip Yancey, Where is God When It Hurts? And that would be a better resource than what we're doing tonight for somebody who's going through a personal experience, a struggle with evil, pain, or suffering. Tonight, though, as I said, we're going to try to evaluate the issue more objectively and use our God-given reason and rationality to try to understand and give a reply to those who are struggling with the problem of evil or have completely rejected God because of the problem of evil. Give an answer to them, a reply to this objection. Now there's two versions, at least two versions, of the problem of evil. Similarly, when we looked at arguments for God, there were different versions of even, we saw 3 versions of the design argument for God. So when it comes to the problem of evil, there are multiple versions, and we're going to look at the 2 primary versions, the logical problem of evil and then the probability version. Sometimes the probability version is called the evidential problem of evil. So we'll start with the logical problem of evil. We've seen before that there's reasonable inferences that we can make from the arguments we've evaluated that argue for the existence of God. From the design argument, the first cause argument, and the moral argument, we can draw certain inferences. And we've talked about these before, that the supreme being would have to be supernatural, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, incredibly powerful, incredibly intelligent, personal, and morally perfect. We used abductive reasoning to draw these inferences from those arguments. And in fact, this is how most theists throughout history in different parts of the world have understood what God is like, what this supreme being is like. And that's not a coincidence. As we've discussed before, the reason most theists have understood God this way is that they all came to believe in a supreme being through the same type of arguments that they developed as they just considered reality, nature around them, themselves, and used their own God-given reason, as I understand it, to try to understand reality. A lot of people groups came to this conclusion: this is what God is like. And that's not a coincidence, because it was the same arguments that these different people groups throughout history developed as they observed reality around them. However, when you evaluate this list, or when you start thinking of God like this, many people realize that there seems to be a problem here. In other words, there seems, if this is what God is like, then how do you explain another aspect of reality, namely all the evil, suffering, and pain that we see in the world? If this is what God is like, then why is there so much pain and suffering? And all these theistic groups that have arisen throughout history have struggled with this issue. So this goes back at least as far as ancient Greek philosophy struggled with this issue. And we do as well. If we're theists, we struggle with this. And some are so troubled by this problem of evil that they have rejected the idea that there is a supreme being. At least a supreme being that's all-powerful and all-good. Now, this problem of evil is still in our cultural consciousness, so to speak. It's still discussed, right? This isn't something that just arose in ancient Greek philosophy and then just kind of disappeared. No, it's something that is still talked about today. So I want to show you an example. In fact, I was kind of shocked, I shouldn't have been, but I was kind of shocked to see the problem of evil articulated in a recent DC movie. So if you've seen the movie Batman v Superman, the writers, directors put the problem of evil in the mouth of the villain, in the mouth of Lex Luthor, which I thought was really interesting. But Lex Luthor in that movie, Batman v Superman, does a good job summarizing the problem of evil. I'm going to give you the quote here in just a second. Now, in the quote, it will be a little bit confusing, but in the quote, he starts out talking about Superman, but then he jumps from Superman, as you'll see, to applying this problem to God. So take a look. This is Lex Luthor in Batman v Superman. He was talking to Superman at the time, and he said, "The problem of evil in the world, the problem of absolute virtue, the problem of you, Superman, on top of everything else, you above all, Here he makes the jump, because that's what God is. No man in the sky intervened when I was a boy to deliver me from daddy's fists and abominations. I figured out way back, if God is all powerful, he can't be all good. And if he's all good, then he can't be all powerful. And that's actually a pretty good summary of the problem of evil that goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. Now we'll put it a little bit more formally here so we can start unwrapping it and start developing a defense to the problem of evil. So you can put it a little bit more formally and simply like this. There seems to be a contradiction among these three assertions. In other words, it doesn't seem like all three of these things can be true at the same time. That God is all powerful, that God is all good, and that there is evil and suffering that exists in the world. Because, as Lex Luthor said, if there is an all-powerful, all-good God, then why doesn't he stop the evil and suffering? Why didn't he stop Lex Luthor's father from abusing him as a child, for instance? So the conclusion, according to the problem of evil, the conclusion is either that God can't stop the pain and suffering, then i.e. he's not all powerful, or it must be the case that he won't, which would mean therefore that he's not all good. So again, it seems like there's a contradiction here. Now sometimes Christian apologists, Christian philosophers will, when an atheist makes this argument, this problem of evil, sometimes Christian apologists will try to push back like this. They'll say, you atheist, you can't throw this problem at me because you don't even have an explanation for evil to begin with. You can't even believe in evil because as an atheist, you have no foundation for morality. Right, wrong, good, evil. Goes back to the moral argument that we discussed previously. Now, I don't think that's a very good reply from the Christian apologist to make that move, and I'll tell you why. I agree that atheists don't have a good explanation for objective morality. That is the basis of the moral argument. However, a well thought out, a thoughtful atheist is going to say, hey, no, I'm not claiming that there is objective right and wrong, objective good and evil. I'm just pointing out that you, Christian theist, have contradictory beliefs. I'm pointing out in your belief system, you have a contradiction and you have to deal with that. Because if you have a contradiction in your belief system, that's a good sign it's not true. And we all recognize that. Contradictions can't be true. Therefore, if your belief system has a contradiction internal to it, it's a good sign that your belief system, i.e. theism, is false. So I don't think that's a good move by the theist. The most common strategy is to present the most common strategy of a theist to reply to the problem of evil. The most common strategy is to present a defense, a possible scenario where all three of these things are true. Now, it doesn't have to be the actual scenario. This is what hangs people up a lot. All it has to be is a possible scenario. Because what this, at least the logical version of the problem of evil, is trying to point out is that it's impossible for all three of these things to be true. It's impossible for God to exist. That's what a contradiction is. A contradiction is something that's impossible. Contradictions are impossible. Therefore, the conclusion of the logical problem of evil is that it's impossible for God to exist. So all we have to do in order to counter an impossibility is show how there could be a scenario which is a possible scenario. It doesn't have to be the actual real scenario, but just a possible scenario where all three of these things are true. And if we have a possible scenario, then that defeats the logical problem of evil. In other words, it shows that it's not impossible for these things to all be true. And this is the big difference between a theodicy and a defense. We're going to look at theodicies later tonight, but in dealing with the logical version of the problem of evil, all we need to do is provide a defense. A theodicy tries to give the actual, real reasons why God allows evil, whereas a defense only attempts to present a possible scenario. I think we would prefer theodicies, and we'll, try to develop some later. But for the logical version of the problem of evil, we don't even have to go there. All we have to do is present a possible scenario. Now, the most famous defense to the logical problem of evil is called the free will defense. And this goes way back as well. This is nothing new. It goes as far back, at least, if not further, but at least as far back as St. Augustine in the 4th century. The most popular version of the free will defense nowadays, though, is presented by our friend Alvin Plantinga. We've talked about Alvin Plantinga, a well-known Christian contemporary philosopher the last 50 years. We've talked about him a lot. Just as a reminder, he was one of the leaders, if not the key leader, in this Christian renaissance that's taken place in academic philosophy over the last 20, 30 years. Here's a quote again from that Time magazine article we looked at in the beginning of this class. Time magazine wrote, in a quiet revolution in thought and arguments that hardly anyone could have foreseen only 2 decades ago, God's making a comeback. Most intriguingly, this is happening not among theologians or ordinary believers, but in the crisp intellectual circles of academic philosophers, where the consensus had long banished the Almighty from fruitful discourse. And in the article, Alvin Plantinga is called America's leading Orthodox Protestant philosopher of God. So I'm going to show you a video now, and this is just an interview that was done with Plantinga, and it's about a 4-minute long video where he gets the opportunity to introduce or explain his version of the free will defense. So take a look, and we'll put the links to this below on YouTube where you can click and watch it directly in case it doesn't come through well here on this camera.
Alvin, you've defined difference between a so-called theodicy and a defense. How do you differentiate?
Well, when we're thinking about an argument against God's existence from evil, the question might be, why does God permit evil? A theodicy would be an attempt to answer that question and say, well, here's why God permits it for the following reasons. Whereas a defense could be offered by somebody who says, I don't know what God's reasons are. Maybe his reasons are totally beyond us. But at least I can show you that there isn't any contradiction between the existence of evil on the one hand and God's being holy, good, and omniscient and omnipotent on the other hand.
So how do you approach it?
I've always thought it was really hard for us to say what God's reasons would actually be. It looks, and if you look at lots of the things that happens, the Holocaust, for example, what could his reason be when he just doesn't know what the reason is there? So I've instead offered a defense, a free will defense with respect to the problem of evil. And the basic idea is to show, contrary to what some people say, that there's no contradiction in asserting both that God exists and is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good, and that there is such a thing as evil.
How do you do that?
Well, the free will defense roughly goes like this. God is omnipotent, but that doesn't mean that he can bring about just every possible state of affairs. So, for example, he can't cause it to be the case that I freely do something or other, freely give, say, $100 to my church. He can't cause me to do that freely. If he causes me to do it, I don't do it freely. So the free will defense says that, first of all, there are possible worlds in in which there are free creatures who only do what is right. But maybe those worlds are ones that God can't create. But it could be that for any free creature you pick out, if God were to create that creature and put him in this in any particular circumstance you mentioned, any possible world you mentioned, that creature would do at least one wrong thing. Any creature like that would suffer from what I called transworld depravity. Transworld depravity says only that for any world in which God could have actualized you, you would perform at least one wrong action.
And that, therefore, God could not create a possible world in which there was no evil.
Therefore, he could not create a possible world in which there were free creatures of no evil. Any world he created that had free creatures in it would contain some evil. And maybe that was a good exchange. Maybe the price was right, you might say, from God's point of view.
You and others have eliminated the logical requirement that if you have evil, then you have no God. But you've not dealt with the magnitude and the enormity. So probabilistically, there's probably no God, even though logically you cannot exclude the possibility.
That's certainly, that's the way things have gone. But now the suggestion is right, that the existence of all this evil just makes it vastly unlikely, extremely unlikely that there is such a person as God. Well, I think believers in God have to admit we don't know. We don't know why God permits those in any detail at least. But the question is whether that makes it unlikely that God does have a reason. I mean, suppose God does have a reason. Is it likely that I would know? Would you and I be the first person to tell? Maybe his reasons are totally beyond our ken. Maybe we just don't know enough about what his circumstances are like to have any grasp of what his reasons might be.
So we'll unpack some of the terms and some of the concepts that he introduced there. But just as a reminder, he's presenting a possible scenario. Okay, he's not claiming, and we're not claiming in this free will defense that this is the actual scenario. It might be. But the whole point here is that all we need is a possible scenario. So here's the possible scenario that he has proposed. In every possible world that God could create with free creatures, and when we use the term world in this context, we're not meaning world like Earth. We're meaning world more like universe. So when we use the term world, we're talking about the entire universe, so different universes, and everything that happens within that timeline of that universe. Okay, so when I say world, just think of an entire existence, an entire reality. So God could create different realities, different universes. But in this conversation, people just use the term world to refer to these different realities, these different universes. So, in every possible world that God could create with free creatures, what if it's the case, in this scenario, says, what if it's the case if some of them always choose evil? Now, he had a term for this. He called it transworld depravity. You might be familiar with the term total depravity, just meaning that humans are totally depraved, we're thoroughly evil. This term, transworld depravity, says that, for example, if I was transworld depraved, in any circumstance, in any universe, in any reality that God would put me in, I would choose evil at least one time. So if there are some beings, some creatures like that are transworld depraved, then God could not force them to choose good freely. Now obviously, God being omnipotent, he could force them to do good, but he couldn't force them to do good freely. That would be a contradiction. If something is forced, then it wouldn't be free. So you might think, well, why wouldn't God then create a world, a universe, where he did force people to do good? Well, it seems to a lot of philosophers that forcing someone or forcing people to do good isn't truly moral goodness. In fact, that seems more like programmed robots. So when we program a car, or we program a robot to do something, and let's say we program a robot to do a good thing, has that robot really done a good thing? No, it's more that the person who programmed the robot did a morally good thing. The robot itself was just taking orders. It was determined. It was forced to do that. So we wouldn't congratulate the robot. There was no true moral goodness that the robot did. It was the programmer that would be congratulated in that case. Similarly, if God would just force us to do good, force us to do the right thing, that would not be true moral goodness. So it makes sense, it's plausible at least in this scenario, if beings suffer from transworld depravity, that God would still choose to create creatures with free will, so there could be true moral goodness. That maybe moral goodness is something that is so valuable or so important for God that He would allow free will, even though He knew some would choose it, make evil choices with their free will and then cause pain and suffering. But it was worth it, as He said, the price was right, so to speak. It was worth it so that true moral goodness could exist in this world, in this universe. So what Plantinga is doing here is he's presenting a possible scenario where all three of these things could be true, showing that there's not necessarily a contradiction here. So here's a quote from Plantinga. He says, "It's possible that God, even being all-powerful, could not create a world with free creatures who never choose evil. Furthermore, it's possible that God, even being all good, would desire to create a world which contains evil if moral goodness requires free moral creatures." So if this scenario were the actual scenario, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but if it were the actual scenario, it would seem then that God would have a choice to make from these three options. If this were the case, that some would always choose evil, no matter what universe, no matter what He would put, circumstances He would put them in, different worlds, then God would have to choose either one, to create nothing, two, to create a world where He forces everybody to always choose good. But again, that would be more like robots, wouldn't be true moral goodness in that world. Or the third option that God would have would be to create a world with free will creatures, thus allowing for true moral goodness, at the same time, though, knowing that some will use their free will to choose evil, causing pain and suffering. And it seems reasonable that if God was facing these three choices, then He would choose three. The importance of having true moral goodness would be worth it, would make the pain and suffering that comes along with it worth it. And it's also possible, consider for just a moment all the possible worlds under the third option, right? So this isn't just three worlds, these are three different types of worlds. So in the third option, there would be almost an infinite range of worlds that God could create just within the third category, right? With free creatures, so there's true moral goodness, but some use it for evil. So even within three, there would be some worlds with a lot of evil, some worlds with a little bit of evil, but there would be a balancing act, and we don't know the calculus here, obviously, but we could hypothesize in this possible scenario that of all the options in category 3, God chose the one with the least amount of evil and suffering and or the most amount of moral goodness. So maybe there's an optimal balance between allowing so much pain and suffering in order to also allow X amount of moral goodness. Again, we don't have that calculus, but we could imagine an infinite being like God, if there is such a being, knowing the infinite possible worlds in category 3, and then choosing the best possible one. In other words, the one that either minimizes pain and suffering or maximizes moral goodness, or does both, does that minimum and maximization at the same time. So in that sense, some philosophers have concluded that this is the best possible world with free creatures. And it's a reasonable, I think that you could make a reasonable case for that. Now I want to show you an animated video now. This is somebody who came along and is trying to summarize this Plantinga's free will defense with an animated video, but I thought they did a good job. Take a look at this.
The Center for Philosophy of Religion presents the Free Will Defense. If God exists, God is perfectly good and all-powerful. But if God is so good, wouldn't he really want to prevent evil? And if God is so powerful, wouldn't he be able to do exactly what he really wants? Thoughts like these have led many to believe that it would be impossible for both God and evil to exist. But Alvin Plantinga has argued that they can coexist after all. Being all-powerful is impressive, but not even an omnipotent God can make a square with no corners or a rock too heavy for God to lift. Omnipotence gives God control over what is possible, not the power to do the impossible. Plantinga proposes that it is also impossible for God to ensure that we never use our freedom to bring about evil. But why? The answer depends on what is required for freedom. Part of what makes an action, say Jane's riding her bike, free, is that she is also able to do something else instead. If Jane is simply forced or caused by something else to ride her bike in a way that undermines her ability to do otherwise, then Jane's act isn't truly free. Accordingly, if God chooses to create a world with free creatures, he cannot guarantee that they always use their freedom in the right way. Any such guarantee would simply eliminate genuine freedom, and also eliminate all the value freedom brings into the world. On Plantinga's view, God is responsible for the existence of the beings that possess free will, and of their surroundings. But what comes of that gift of freedom is ultimately up to them, not God. At best, this shows only that God couldn't ensure that the world contained both free will and no evil. But couldn't God just create a world with neither instead? Perhaps the answer is that free will is a great good, a magnificent good. So incredibly good that the combination of free will together with the evil that accompanies it is more valuable than any world God could have created instead with no free creatures. Now, maybe that's not God's actual reason for permitting the kind of evil that arises from misusing freedom. And so we don't have what philosophers call a theodicy. We might not even be capable of knowing God's actual reason. Nevertheless, it is one possible explanation of how God and evil could both exist. And that's enough to serve as an adequate defense against that impossibility claim. Plantinga's free will defense. Still, we might wonder why God couldn't create only those people who would always freely do what is right. For Plantinga's answer to this surprisingly hard question, click here. To learn more about these ideas, please visit plantingavideos.com.
And we'll watch that next video here in just a couple minutes. Now, in that video, there were some things said about free will that I will later disagree with, as you'll see. In addition, I would disagree with what was said in the video about free will being such a great thing. I don't think that free will is valuable in and of itself. It seems to me that free will just allows true moral goodness, and that's what's valuable. Without free will, you wouldn't be able to have true moral goodness. So it's not the free will that's valuable in and of itself, but it's the true moral goodness that free will would allow. But there's something else about the way he defined free will in that video that I'll try to correct or disagree with later. So let's talk about some objections. What do people say to this free will defense? Well, sometimes people reject it because they feel, and this is theists even who reject it, because they feel it limits God. And they have such a strong intuition that God has no limits. My reply to this is that, yes, there is a sense in which this limits God, but I don't think it limits God in a troublesome way. Let me explain what I mean by that. Now, most everybody agrees that God faces logical impossibilities. For example, in the video, he talked about how God can't create a square circle, right? There's lots of things that God can't do. God can't lie. That would be a contradiction. A morally perfect being can't do something that's immoral. So most all theists would affirm that God faces logical impossibilities. And we're just noting here that forcing a free act is logically impossible. That's why God can't do it. It's not that it limits God's omnipotence in some way. It's just that he can't do something that's contradictory, just like he can't create a square circle or he can't lie. But some will go further and say they reject this free will defense because of the idea of God facing an actual impossibility. So we have to think through what the difference is between a logical impossibility and an actual impossibility. An actual impossibility is something that's logically possible, but in practice is impossible. So I'll just give you a simple, silly example using myself. So it's not logically impossible for me to jump over my house, right? I'm not violating any laws of logic there. I wouldn't be making some sort of contradiction that's impossible, jumping over my house. So it's logically possible for me to be able to jump over my house, but in practice it's not. In that sense, I, as a finite being, face an actual impossibility. And this is very common, right, in our lives and our experiences as finite beings, that there's actual impossibilities we face all the time, right? I can't just fly to the moon right now in my own strength, right? I can't jump over my house. There's all sorts of things that are actually impossible. Even though there's no logical contradiction there, they're actually impossible. The idea, though, that God faces things that are actually impossible does rub some theists the wrong way. But again, just go back to this idea of God forcing a free action. That's logically impossible, God forcing a free action. Now, of course, God has the power to do that. We're not taking away anything from his omnipotence, but if he forced a being to do something, then it wouldn't be freely chosen, right? So that's a logical contradiction. What this leads to, though, is an actual impossibility. And let me explain how this would come about for God to face an actual impossibility, because it flows from that logical impossibility of forcing a free action. So let me give you an example. If God creates beings with free will, then it limits God's choices in that it limits the actually possible worlds he has to choose from. If you can imagine, again, we're kind of anthropomorphism here, thinking of God in human terms, but if you can imagine God having before him all the different possible worlds that he could create, right? And it seems like there'd almost be infinite, but as a supreme being, he could think through all these possible worlds that he could create. But if he's going to put free creatures in these worlds, then that limits the type of worlds he has to choose from. That narrows down the possibilities, gives him a smaller set to choose from if he's going to put free will in them. Because if he gives creatures free will, then he can't force their choices. So, for example, I'll just use a silly example here. Let's say there's a being named Mike that God is considering creating, and Mike, this individual Mike, would freely choose to wear red shorts in any possible world that God would create. He would freely make that decision to choose red shorts in any possible world that God would create. With Mike giving him free will, he would choose to wear red shorts. Now, of course, God could force him to wear blue shorts. God is omnipotent. He can make Mike do anything he wants. But if he gives Mike freedom, if God is only going to limit himself to worlds where Mike has free will, then these other worlds where Mike doesn't wear red shorts are really an actual impossibility for God. He could create them, of course, but not, he couldn't create them where Mike has free will and he chooses not to wear red shorts. So it does limit God's choices in that respect. So God faces an actual impossibility in that he is not able to create a world with free creatures who always choose good. If, again, a possible scenario, if in every possible world some always choose evil. Let's move on to the second objection. The second objection to Plantinga's free will defense is that, well, if that is the scenario that God was facing, then why wouldn't he just create those beings, just create those persons or creatures who would only ever choose to do good? I mean, if God would know everything about the future and what every free will creature would, the choices that they would freely make in any possible world that God would create, God knows all those things. So why wouldn't God just create the persons who he knows only use their free will to choose good? And this objection was brought up at the end of that video and pointed us to the next one, which we'll take a look at now.
The Center for Philosophy of Religion presents Transworld Depravity. Letty has 3 boys she would like to treat with ice cream cones. She can serve the ice cream in the living room, kitchen, or the bedroom. It's possible that each boy eats his dessert with no problems, and that all 3 have a lovely time. That's what Letty would like. But whether that turns out to be what actually happens will be up to her boys in the end, and not to her. As it turns out, each boy is inclined toward naughtiness. Being placed in the living room will trigger a fight over who chooses what music to play. The kitchen will see a fuss over the last cookie in the jar. And occupying the top bunk will be the prize of a bedroom wrestling match. Even though the boys possess the ability to behave themselves, they won't. No matter where Letty puts them with their ice cream, each boy will do something or other that is wrong, and will do it freely too, since he had it in his power to do otherwise. When people hear that God could have created any number of different individuals and placed them in different possible scenarios, and given them a gift of free will, they ask, well, why didn't God just select those people who would always use their freedom in the right way? Why not choose to create just the ones that are able to act wrongly, but who won't, so long as they're in the right circumstances, which God could certainly provide? Alvin Plantinga has proposed an answer to this question. Perhaps, just like Letty, God isn't necessarily able to guarantee the outcome he most desires. Why? Because it is possible that every person who could be created suffers from what Plantinga calls transworld depravity. Creating a free creature is up to God, but just how that gift of freedom is used is left up to the person who has it. It is possible that every person created in any possible setting is just like Letty's boys. If brought into being with the gift of free will, the person will, not must, but will use that freedom in the wrong way at least once. That would be a shame. It is possible everyone acts rightly, and yet they won't. Moreover, God can't force them to do so either. Not even an omnipotent being can do the impossible and permit freedom while always preventing its misuse, since freedom partially consists in not being thus manipulated. Still, the value of sharing an ice cream treat may be worth letting permitting a squabble over who chooses the music. And similarly, Plantinga argues, securing the range of value that comes with free will may be a magnificent enough good for God to permit the evil resulting from its misuse. To learn more about these ideas,
So the bottom line is, the response to this objection is, it could be the case that all creatures suffer from transworld depravity. Originally, when we were discussing the free will defense, we were just entertaining the idea that some creatures suffered from transworld depravity. But maybe it's the case, again, a possibility, don't know if it's the actual scenario, might be, might not, but it's possible that all creatures, all possible free will creatures that God would create, would eventually choose evil at some point in their existence. All free creatures might suffer from this, what he's calling transworld depravity. If that would be the case, then it would not be possible to create a world with only those who ever choose good, because there are no such possible people, free creatures. So to summarize here, the free will defense, by putting out this possible scenario, defeats the logical problem of evil because it shows there's no contradiction here. It's possible that all these things could be true at the same time. Now we're going to move on to the next version of the problem of evil, but before we do, I just want to make one comment here about the problem of evil in general. It seems as though for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of people who raise the problem of evil, it seems as though they're actually blaming the wrong person. Okay? A lot of times when people make or present the problem of evil, they're blaming God for evil, or angry at God for the evil and suffering that he's allowing. But it seems like they're shifting responsibility in some situations. Take a look at this quote from C.S. Lewis. I think he sums it up well, like he always does. C.S. Lewis wrote, "First, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. Second, they do not in fact behave in that way. We all know it. The truth is, we believe in decency so much that we cannot bear to face the fact that we're breaking it, and so consequently we try to shift the responsibility." And in a sense, the problem of evil is doing that. The problem of evil is trying to blame God for evil and suffering, where in actuality, it's our fault. It's my fault. Sometimes we get mad at God because we don't think he should allow evil, but we're ultimately the cause of evil. It reminds me of a situation, let's say a teenager wants to borrow the car. So the parent gives the teenager keys to the car, and the teenager goes out, speeds, gets caught, and gets a speeding ticket. Well, imagine that teenager coming back home then after getting a speeding ticket and being mad at the parent for allowing them to drive the car. Well, that would be shifting responsibility. It wasn't the parent's fault. The parent gave the teenager the ability to drive the car, but it was the teenager's choice to speed which got him in trouble. And it seems like sometimes the problem of evil is presented that way. That we're mad at God for allowing this evil and suffering, where in fact we're the cause. We're to blame for the evil and suffering. So I think sometimes the key question to ask, and it depends on the person you're talking to, right? You want to be respectful and handle it well, because this isn't everybody's motivation. But sometimes I think the appropriate answer or the appropriate question to raise in light of the problem of evil is this: how much pain and suffering would there be if we all made the right choice? In other words, if we all made the correct choices, the correct moral choices, how much pain and suffering could we eliminate in this world? It seems to me quite a lot. Most, and if not all, of the pain and suffering would be eliminated if we always did the right thing, if we always made the right moral choice. I mean, all rape, all murder, all neglect, all poverty, all of that would be gone if we all, as human beings, always made the right choice. If we, pooled our money on preventing or warning people about natural disasters instead of spending our money on football games or the new iPhone, I think we would eliminate a lot of suffering and poverty in the world. But we, including myself, don't make the right moral choices. So we're to blame. What if, all the money that we spend on new TVs and new cars and just drove the cars we had and watched on the old TVs that we have? What if we took all that money and applied it towards cancer research? Well, I think we would quickly eliminate a lot of the pain and suffering that comes from diseases. Not all of it, possibly, but a lot of it. So again, I think the pain and suffering that we see and experience in the world is not God's fault, it's ours. Natural disasters, in this line of thinking, natural disasters might be a little bit more difficult, but if Christianity is true, we haven't made the case for full-fledged Christianity yet, but if Christianity is true, then even natural disasters would be the result of our evil choices, going all the way back to Adam and Eve and then bringing God's judgment into the world and allowing death and pain and suffering to begin with, i.e. natural disasters, even cancer. All of the troubles that we experience is the result of our evil choices, if Christianity is true. So it seems as though blaming God is not the right place to place the blame. It seems like we're the cause of evil, not God. So I want to summarize now that we've covered the logical problem of evil. I want to end this section before we move on to the probability version by summarizing it with William Lane Craig's ministry, put together a great video about the logical problem of evil. So take a look at this.
We are all well aware of the suffering people in the world. Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship Him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then He's not all-powerful. If He is able to prevent evil, but not willing, He is not good. But if He is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if He is neither able nor willing, then why call Him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, He can create any world He wants. And if God is all-loving, He prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil.
And that's where we're going next. We're going to cover now the probability version of the problem of evil. It's true, how this video ended, that most philosophers, both theists and atheists, agree that the logical problem of evil has been sufficiently debunked. It has been sufficiently answered, and so nobody really raises it at that academic philosophical level. You'll still, encounter it at a popular level, of course, but academic professional philosophers realize that Plantinga and others have done a good job providing possible scenarios, which, again, defeats the logical version of the problem of evil. So let's move on now to the probability version, and let me use this to kind of set it up or explain how this version differs. Why is it called the probability version of the problem of evil? Well, consider a situation where you move to a new city. I don't know, let's say you move here to Lincoln, Nebraska. And you're excited because you've been told by numerous people that here in this city, in Lincoln, is where Superman lives. So you've made a good choice. You've chosen a good city to move to because Superman's here and he always swoops in and saves the day. So we don't have any problems here. There's never any carjackings, there's never any murders, there's never any problems here because when any bad guy tries to do something, Superman flies in and rescues the person. He saves the day. So you've made a good choice. Good job moving to Lincoln, Nebraska. However, let's say that after you've moved here, you live here 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and you see a lot of murders, carjackings. In fact, somebody robs you on the street at gunpoint. And you see on the news and you experience it yourself all of this terrible pain and evil and suffering for 15, 20 years. Well, you might start wondering at some point, is Superman really here? Now, it's not logically impossible, right? He might be here and Lex Luthor is keeping him captive somewhere for 20 years with kryptonite or something. It's not logically impossible for Superman to be here. But after 20 years of evidence, you probably would start wondering if Superman was really here or not. In fact, all that pain and suffering and evil would be good evidence to conclude that Superman probably isn't here. And that's why it's called the probability version of the problem of evil. So it's not an impossibility that God exists. It's just that all this evil is good evidence that he probably doesn't exist, God. Now this is more difficult to deal with because the claim isn't as strong, or the conclusion isn't as strong. The logical problem, the logical version of the problem of evil, is a very strong claim that it's impossible for God, logically impossible for God to exist. And that's such a strong claim that it's easier to counter because all we need to do is provide a possible scenario, as we've discussed. But the probability version isn't as strong as a claim. It's not saying it's impossible for God to exist. It's just probable that he doesn't, based on all of this evidence. Evil, in other words. Now, one simple way to respond, and I think it's a decent way, but it's a simple way to respond to the probability version of the problem of evil, is just to say, yeah, granted, the problem of evil does seem to be fairly good evidence that God doesn't exist. However, we have all this evidence that God does exist. The moral argument, the design argument, the first cause argument, and those are just the big three. We could list all sorts of other reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God. And so when you compare, and this is what they do in a courtroom, right? Say somebody is on trial for murder, there's always going to be, the defense is going to provide evidence that they're innocent, and the prosecution is going to provide evidence that they're guilty, and you have to compare which side has more or greater evidence. And that's how you, make your decision as the jury or the judge. And the same thing could be said here. Yeah, maybe if all we had was the problem of evil, we would conclude that there is no God. However, when you compare that to all the evidence there is for God, that outweighs this evidence. And I think that's a legitimate way to reply to the probability version of the problem of evil. That's fairly simple, so we want to go a little bit more in depth and make a direct response to the probability version. Now, what I want to do first is just show you the flow of how this conversation has gone, historically, and how it usually goes in a debate or a conversation between a theist and an atheist, okay? So this is how the conversation has taken place historically over thousands of years, but it's also how it usually takes place in a conversation on this issue between an atheist and a theist. So I want to show you that first, and then we'll come back and we'll make some other comments. So here's how the back and forth usually goes and how it has gone throughout history. So it starts out with the atheist making the probability version of the problem of evil. Okay, we've covered that, you know what it is. So that's put out there, right? That's the beginning of the conversation, if you will. Now, the most common response from the theistic side, what a theist usually does, is they present some sort of a theodicy. And remember the difference between a theodicy and a defense. A theodicy is an attempt to explain why God allows evil. So it's an attempt to explain the actual situation. Not just a possible situation, but the actual reason or the actual explanation for why God allows evil. And the most common theodicy that's presented, not only by Christian theists, but really all theists throughout history, the most common theodicy that's presented here is referred to as the greater good theodicy. The greater good theodicy. So let's make sure we understand this theodicy. According to the greater good theodicy, which again is an attempt to provide an explanation for why God allows evil, but the greater good theodicy says that out of every evil that God allows, He does so, He allows it in order to bring about a greater good, or prevent a greater evil. Let me say that again. For each evil that God allows, He does allow it in order to bring about a greater good or prevent a worse evil. Thus, God is justified in every evil that He allows, because again, He brings from it a greater good or prevents a worse evil. And we can think of examples just in our own life where we do this, right? So I've taken my kids to the dentist all throughout their life, and they hate it just like I hate going to the dentist because it's painful, right? But we allow them to go through that pain and suffering because in the long run, it's good for them. There's a greater good, and so parents are justified in putting their kids through that pain. Similarly, parents are justified in allowing their children to be hurt terribly, cut open with a knife, i.e. surgery, if in the long run it's for their greater good. So even being cut open with a knife, parents are justified in allowing that to happen to their children for surgery if it results in a greater good. So it makes intuitive sense. That's the greater good theodicy. Now the objection back from the atheist usually comes like this. Again, I'm just walking you through the historic flow of how this conversation usually goes and how it has gone down through history. So the main objection to the greater good theodicy is this idea of gratuitous evil. And don't get thrown off by the term. Gratuitous evil just means evil that has no purpose. In other words, the atheist says, look, it doesn't seem plausible that there's a greater good that comes out of every instance of evil. I mean, come on. How could there be any good that comes from a little child being raped and then buried alive? How could any good come from that? No, there seems to be some purposeless evil. Some evil that has no purpose, that doesn't accomplish any greater good. That's gratuitous evil. So this is the pushback to the greater good theodicy, this idea of gratuitous evil. It can be put a little bit more formally like this. So this would be the argument from gratuitous evil. Number one, God would not allow purposeless evil if He was all good and all powerful. Number two, there are some instances of evil that serve no purpose. There's no good that comes from them. Therefore, number three, God probably doesn't exist. Now, obviously, for this objection to work, they have to defend premise 2. They have to defend the idea that there are instances of evil which accomplish no greater good. One of the famous examples of this is a baby deer dying in a forest fire. I don't know why whoever started this didn't use a small child dying in a forest fire. That seems worse to me. But regardless, the classic example is a baby deer dying in a forest fire, all by itself. How could any good ever come from the pain and suffering that baby deer experienced? Maybe it's causing us to, maybe we care more for baby innocent deer than we do for humans sometimes. Maybe it's playing on our emotions. Regardless, that's the famous example, a baby deer dying in a forest fire. So how have theists responded then to this gratuitous evil objection? Well, of course, they've challenged premise 2, right? Challenged the claim that there is such a thing as gratuitous evil. This is the back and forth, how it usually has gone. So the theist at this point will say, look, it's very difficult for you, the atheist, to prove that an instance of evil serves no purpose. Just because we don't know what the purpose is doesn't mean that there isn't one, right? So here are some ways that you could respond to somebody who is making this gratuitous evil objection. You could say to them, look, how do you know that this instance of evil that you're bringing up serves no purpose? How could you, as a finite being, how could you know all the implications that might come from this experience or come from that situation? There's no way for you to know all the ripple effects. And if this life isn't the end of the story, there could be ripple effects that we're not even able to see in this lifetime, in this world, so to speak, right? If theism is true and there is an afterlife, even the baby deer in the forest fire might live beyond the death that they experience in the forest fire. And there might be a greater good for that baby deer that somehow, I don't know how, but God brings out of their experience of evil, pain, suffering in that forest fire. So I think this is a legitimate way to respond back to the idea of gratuitous evil, to ask these sort of questions, to push back on that idea. Here's another way to do it, and this is a very common tactic in philosophy. In fact, this would be a good strategy for you to learn in many situations. It's called flipping the argument back. So let's do this real quick, and I think you'll see the usefulness of this strategy. So here's the argument, right? Here's the argument from gratuitous evil that the atheist is making, and we can flip it back, okay? So here's how we can do that. Well, first we could just affirm the first premise, right? We would say, no, I agree with you. God would not allow purposeless evil. Being an all-good, all-powerful God, He would not allow purposeless evil. I agree with you. Premise 1, I affirm. However, when I say flip it back, we would replace premise 2 with this, that God exists. And we could say, look, I think I have more reasons and evidence to believe in my premise 2 than your premise 2. I think there's better reasons and evidence to believe that God exists than that gratuitous or purposeless evil exists. We can compare these premises, you defend your 2, I'll defend my 2. I think I can do a better case, moral argument, first cause argument, design argument, with my premise than you can trying to prove that there is an instance of evil that serves no greater good. That seems a very difficult premise for you to defend. But if my premise 2, if I can defend it well, then my conclusion follows, that purposeless evil probably doesn't exist. Again, I'm making a probabilistic argument just like you are, but since my premise 2 is stronger, my probabilistic conclusion, therefore then, would be stronger. Now, I don't know what the purpose is to every evil. I'm not taking on that burden of proof. I'm just claiming there is one, even though I don't know it. Now, I think this is a strong reply against the gratuitous evil objection. But I want to look at other theodicies because I don't like the greater good theodicy for other reasons that I'll discuss here in a few minutes. So even though I think this is a good way to reply to the gratuitous evil objection, I don't really care for the entire greater good theodicy. So there are other theodicies out there, and we're not going to talk about all of them. I just want to mention a few of them, just so that you're aware of them. Maybe this is something you would like to write your paper on for this class. So for example, there's a soul-making theodicy, natural law theodicy, a created order theodicy, which I'll explain here in a minute. But these might be some things that you want to chase down and explore. One of the reasons I don't like the greater good theodicy is that it, at least sometimes the way it's presented, is it seems to imply that God needs evil in order to bring about good things. For example, sometimes when the greater good theodicy is explained, people say that God's overall reason for allowing evil is to bring about a greater good. That's God's overall reason. That's why He allows evil, is to bring about greater good from those instances of evil. And I just think that paints a very odd picture of God, that He needs evil in order to bring about good. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't care for the greater good theodicy as a whole. So one of these other theodicies, the created order theodicy, was developed by one of my professors, philosophy professors, Bruce Little. This is a popular level book that he wrote explaining his created order theodicy. And I would encourage you to check it out, especially if this is something that you want to pursue your paper on, possibly. And in Dr. Little's created order theodicy, he agrees with the atheist that there are instances of gratuitous evil. It's an interesting strategy, but he affirms that yes, there are instances of evil that serve no purpose. There's purposeless evil that takes place in the world. But Dr. Little argues that this doesn't count against God. God's justified in allowing these instances of gratuitous evil for other reasons. But I don't want to go down that path. I just want to make you aware of this if you want to look at it further. What I want to do now is share with you a theodicy that I'm just now developing, okay? It's relatively new in my thinking. It draws on a lot of the work I've done in metaethics, which if you're familiar with my divine love theory, you'll recognize that right away in this. But just lately in my thinking and writing, I've wondered if I can't take my divine love theory and apply it to the problem of evil. So I'm developing, in the just initial stages of developing my own theodicy here, which, no surprise, I call my divine love theodicy. Okay? So I want to take just a few minutes and explain my divine love theodicy. Now, to create this theodicy, which again is an explanation of why God would allow evil, I'm using information not only from general revelation, from philosophy, but also from special revelation. And I know in this class we haven't gone that route yet. I haven't made the case that Jesus is God or that the Bible is from God. But let's say, we're at the end of the semester, we've made that case, and we have good reasons and evidence to believe that the Bible is from God. And so if it is, then we can glean information from it to try to craft a theodicy or an explanation of why God would allow evil. So I'm making use of both general and special revelation in developing this theodicy. Now, in my theodicy, I'm open to the idea that there may or may not be gratuitous evil, okay? Or there may or may not be a purpose for every evil. My theodicy doesn't require that either way. Now, I lean, just personally, I lean towards the idea that God does work out a greater good from every evil that He allows, because it seems to me like God could do that, and it seems like He would do that. But I want to make a clear distinction that that's not the overall reason why God allows evil, so that He can bring greater good from those instances of evil. So again, bringing forth greater good from those instances of evil is not the overall reason that God allowed evil in the first place. So according to my theodicy, what I'm proposing, what is the reason then that God allowed evil in the first place? That's what I'll try to explain here, okay, in my divine love theodicy. It's going to take a little bit of work just to develop it, but that's the question we're seeking here. That's the question we're seeking to answer. What's the overall reason that God allowed evil in the first place? And I would start my explanation like this. I would say, look, God wanted to create beings, creatures, that could resemble Him. And in particular, resemble the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. The three persons, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, are in loving relationships with each other, and God wanted to expand that fellowship, so to speak. He wanted to create other persons, not divine persons, but human persons who could be a part of this loving fellowship. He wanted to create beings in His own image that could love. And that's the very meaning and purpose of our lives. Sometimes we struggle and wonder, what am I here for? What's my purpose? What's the meaning to life? And I would say it simply is personal loving relationships, both with God and with others. That's the meaning to life. That's one of the reasons why Jesus said the greatest commandments are to love God and to love others, because that's what we were made for. Enjoying those relationships, imaging God in loving relationships, because that's what God is. A trinity of three persons in loving relationship with each other. So God created us to love Him and to love others. However, the next step in my theodicy is that true love requires free will. In order to have real, true, loving relationships, you need to have free will. And we've talked about this a little bit before, not in this exact context, but it's the same thing. If you would force somebody to love you, or if someone is forced to love others or to love God, then is that really love? Is that really truly love if they're forced to do it? I mean, if you have a significant loved one in your life, whether it's a romantic loved one, a spouse, a boyfriend, or a girlfriend, do you want them to love you because they're forced to love you? That wouldn't seem like true love. No, you want them to love you because they really do, because they choose to love you. It wouldn't be true love without free will. So, in other words, true love requires free will. So God created us with free will so we could have true loving relationships. And again, it's not that free will is valuable in and of itself, okay? It's not that free will is this important thing that we have to have because it's so valuable. No, it's that the loving relationships are really the ultimate moral value. Because, again, they image God. What is morally good is that which resembles God, or that which images God. And nothing resembles God more than loving relationships, because that's what God is. Those three persons, the Trinity, in loving relationship. So it's the loving relationships that are of most value, most morally valuable, the most valuable moral good are loving relationships. But free will is necessary for them. Free will, in other words, allows the possibility of true loving relationships. But it also allows the possibility to not love. And that's what I think is the definition of evil, is choosing not to love. Not to love God, not to love others. That is the root of evil. So the reason God allows evil in the first place is so that there can be true loving relationships. That's the reason, my theodicy, according to my theodicy, that's the reason for evil, is that God wanted there to be true loving relationships. And to do that, there had to be free will, but that opens up the door to the possibility of evil. And I would lean on, a lot of the free will defense for this as well. God knowing what people would do with their free choices, transworld depravity, the Molinistic type of middle knowledge that God has of knowing the decisions that free creatures would make. I would have to develop that into my theodicy as well, but I'm just leaning on it for now, all of that work in Molinism, both from William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga. One objection to my theodicy, and this comes up often when people make the free will defense, and which is similar to what I'm doing here, right? The importance of free will, not in and of itself, but so that there can be true loving relationships. But whenever this idea of free will comes up, one of the objections to it is this. Well, does this mean then that God doesn't have free will? Because most theists, and most Christian theologies for sure, but even most theists would say God has to love. There's a sense in which God doesn't have a choice. Because of his moral nature, he has to love both us and, love within the members or between the members of the Trinity. That is a necessary love. So if God has to love, is God not free? That seems kind of odd to think of God, not having free will. And this is where some of my philosophical work in free will has been very helpful, because we have to define free will very, very carefully here. And this is where, in one of those Plantinga videos, I think they made a mistake in how they defined free will. Let me say it like this. Oftentimes, people define free will as the ability to choose otherwise. So free will is often defined as the ability to choose the opposite, or to choose otherwise, to love or not to love. That's how free will is often defined. But I don't think that's the right definition of free will. I don't think that's the correct way to define free will. I think a better way to define free will is through agent causation. Agent causation. What do I mean by that? Well, I think free will is better defined as you being the cause of your choices. In other words, you have free will if you are the cause of your choices, not some external force, not some external cause, that you are the cause of your choices. Free will, let me say it like this. Free will requires being the cause of your choices. So the ability to choose otherwise is not necessary for free will. And there have been done, this type of work has been done by a lot of philosophers in this area that show how even people who aren't able to choose otherwise still have free will. So I don't think the ability to choose otherwise is necessary to have free will. What's necessary to have free will is that you are the cause of your choices. That's what's necessary for free will, that there's not some external force causing you to make the choices that you do, but you yourself are the cause. Now, there can be a lot of influences, nature, nurture, our desires, the way we were brought up, our DNA, a lot of influences, but ultimately, if you are the cause of your choices, your volition, right, you making the choices, then I would consider you having free will. So, if you take this back to God then, yes, it's true that God must love, he has to love, but that doesn't make him not free, and it doesn't make his love not real. And here's why. Because God necessarily having to love is not because of some sort of external cause that's forcing him to love, but it's an internal cause to him. It's his moral nature which necessitates him to love. So in this instance, right, or the way I'm explaining it, he is the cause of him having to love. And since he is the cause of his choices, he has free will. He can't choose otherwise, but that's not necessary for free will. Being the cause of your choices is what's necessary for free will. And he loves not because of some external cause, but an internal cause, his own moral, loving nature. God's free, not because he can choose otherwise. He can't, he has to love, but he's free because he himself is the cause of his choices. Whereas us, think about us for a moment. If God created us like him such that we had to love, because that's one of the first things that comes up in this conversation, right? As you can imagine. Well, why don't God just create us like him, where we have to love? But think about that for a moment. If God would make us like him, that we had to love, then we wouldn't be the cause of that choice. God would. There'd be an external cause for us having to love. And that external cause would be God. We'd be robots again. It'd be an external cause, God, which would then make it not free. And if it's not free, I don't see how it can truly be love. So that's the beginnings of my theodicy that I'm developing in this area of the problem of evil, my divine love theodicy. Now, the last thing I want to do tonight is, I guess, continue down this path of special revelation. Right? Because wouldn't it be nice? We've done a lot of speculation tonight. We've been doing a lot of work in philosophy. And as I understand philosophy is simply the study of general revelation. Trying to understand reality best we can, looking at nature, looking at reality with the God-given reason that we have. That's general revelation. That's philosophy. But wouldn't it be nice if God stepped into history and told us why he allowed evil? What I'm referring to, of course, is special revelation. And again, in this class, I haven't made the case that the Bible is from God yet. We're getting there. But let's say we were at the end of the semester and we've made a good case that the Bible is from God. If it is, has he told us more about why he has allowed evil in the Bible? And that's what I want to chase down tonight here as we close for just a few minutes. Now, the Bible doesn't lay out a full-fledged theodicy like we would all prefer. It does talk about evil, so there's some things that we can go through and some verses we can take a look at, but there's not a full-fledged theodicy. And that's why theologians like myself try to develop a theodicy based on verses, based on using our God-given reason to try to give a full-fledged answer as best we can, a little bit speculative, because the Bible just doesn't lay out a full-fledged theodicy. In fact, the first book of the Bible that was ever written, the book of Job, deals with this issue, but it doesn't give an answer. It's kind of frustrating sometimes, and Job was frustrated. The book of Job is really about the problem of evil. Why did God allow all these terrible things to happen to Job? But at the end of the book of Job, the conclusion really is, you need to trust God. Wouldn't it make sense that God would know better than you? And several chapters at the end of the book of Job, God makes the case to Job that you need to trust me. You don't understand these things as well as I do, and so you need to trust me, Job. And I think that's one of the reasons why that was the first book of the Bible, because people wrestle with this. And part of the solution is to trust God. That even if we don't understand, we trust that he is working out things together for good. The Bible explains that God does work things out from evil. He can do that. He doesn't always explain the greater good that he works out from every instance of evil. but he explains situations where he does do that. You might remember the story of Joseph. So Joseph in the Old Testament, he was sold into slavery by his brothers and then got imprisoned for things that he didn't do for years, suffering, pain in prison, even though he was innocent. Probably wondered, what's the purpose to all this evil and suffering in my life? But towards the end of his life, when he was reunited with his brothers, and they thought, after all these years, now that he has the opportunity, he's going to kill us, the brothers, for what they did. But instead, you might remember, Joseph responds like this. He said, "You, my brothers, planned it for evil and actually did commit evil against me, but God worked out or planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people." And you remember the story, it's through Joseph's pain and suffering that he rescued the entire world through the years of famine. So God used that to bring about the evil that his brothers committed. God used that to rescue the entire world. And of course, Joseph is just an image or a foreshadowing of Jesus being betrayed by his brothers, but then through that rescuing the entire world, right? In a salvific sense. The Bible also explains that God is the greatest good, and this plays into my divine love theodicy, right? That if this life, if happiness in this life, the happiness of making money, of pleasure, if that's, what life is all about, then yeah, pain and suffering doesn't make any sense. But if our loving relationship with God is the greatest good, it seems like pain and suffering can actually increase or make that love, our loving relationships with others and with God, a better, or grow that, or make the experience even greater. And so if God is the greatest good, our relationship with Him, then suffering is good if it directs us more to Him in loving relationship. Now, I'll never put down somebody for struggling with the problem of evil. Okay, I struggle with it from time to time. Okay, so I don't criticize somebody for struggling with the problem of evil, especially when you've experienced evil in your own life. It's very, very difficult. And the Bible says that it should frustrate us. Evil and suffering should bother us because, for one thing, it tells us that there's something wrong with this world. And in fact, God, the Bible, says that God hates evil and suffering and death just as much as we do. When I get a chance to preach at funerals, I did the funeral for my best friend who died last summer, 2 summers ago now. Whenever I get a chance to speak at a funeral, I share with folks the story in the Gospels of where one of Jesus' friends died, Lazarus, and how the Bible explains that not only did Jesus weep, shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept when his friend died, but it also says there, the very next verse, that Jesus was angry at the situation. But think about that for a moment. Jesus, God, could be angry at death, pain, suffering, and evil without being angry at Himself as God. So I think the fact that we are upset at evil and suffering and it troubles us and bothers us is the appropriate response. It's God's response to pain, evil, and suffering. And in fact, instead of God coming in to destroy evil and suffering, He stepped in to defeat it. He stepped into history to defeat evil, pain, and suffering. Not destroy it. If He would destroy it, He'd destroy us because we're the cause of evil. But no, He stepped into history to defeat evil, rescue us from it, if you will. I love this quote from theologian John Stott. He said, "I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who is immune to it? But no, God, laid aside His immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood, tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in light of His. There's still a question mark against human suffering, but over it we boldly stamp another mark, the cross, which symbolizes divine suffering. We also know from the Bible that someday he's going to put an end to suffering. It talks about in Revelation how death no longer going to exist. Grief, crying, pain will no longer exist. And sometimes we ask, well, why? Why doesn't God take those things away now? Why doesn't he step in and defeat death now? Well, the Bible also gives an answer to that. In 2 Peter 3, it's explained, to those that are struggling, where's the promise of his coming? Why doesn't he step in and bring judgment now? Why doesn't he make things right now? It's explained here in 2 Peter 3, the present heavens and earth are being stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. The Lord does not delay his promise, as some understand delay, but is patient with you, not wanting any to perish in this judgment, but for all to come to repentance, to turn from their evil and trust in Christ to be forgiven. But based on his promise, we wait for the new heavens and a new earth where righteousness will dwell. So regard the patience of our Lord as an opportunity for salvation, for forgiveness through faith in Christ. Not trusting what you can do to earn it, but what he did for you by suffering on the cross. Jesus promised that if you put your faith in him, you'll be forgiven of all your evil choices, reconciled back to a loving relationship with God, and welcomed into heaven, escaping his judgment, welcomed into heaven for all eternity to be with him and others, to love God and love others for all eternity. The last thing I have for you in this lesson is another video from William Lane Craig now he's summarizing the probability version of the problem of evil. So we'll end with this.
In part 1, we looked at the logical version of the problem of suffering and evil. This argument attempts to show that since suffering and evil exist, it is logically impossible for God to exist. And we explained why even atheist philosophers admit that this argument fails. But wait, it may still be argued that while it's logically possible that God and suffering both exist, it's far from likely. There's just so much pointless suffering, it seems improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting it. This is the probability version of the problem. Suffering provides empirical evidence that God's existence is not impossible, just highly unlikely. Is this a good argument? Consider 3 points. First, we are not in a position to say with any confidence that God probably lacks reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. The problem is that we're limited in space and time, and in intelligence and insight. God, on the other hand, sees every detail of history from beginning to end, and orders it through people's free decisions and actions. In order to achieve his purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework. Sometimes what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator. Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view. In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable. But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion. The third point is, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Consider 4 of these. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness. People often assume that if God exists, his role is to create a comfortable environment for his human pets. They think the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and therefore, God is obligated to keep us happy. However, Christianity presents a radically different view, that the purpose of life is to know God. This alone brings true, lasting fulfillment. Suffering can bring about a deeper, more intimate knowledge of God, either on the part of the one who is suffering or those around him. The whole point of human history is that God, having given us free will, is drawing as many people as he can into his unending kingdom. Suffering is one of the ways God can draw people freely to himself. In fact, countries that have endured the most hardship often show the highest growth rates for Christianity.
God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Terrible human evils are testimony to man's depravity, a consequence of his alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at moral evil in the world. On the contrary, he expects it. The third doctrine states that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul understood that life on earth and whatever suffering it holds for each of us is temporary. Our pain will not endure forever, but our lives with God will. Paul was not belittling the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. Indeed, he was one of them. But he saw that those suffering will be overwhelmed forever by the ocean of joy that God will give to those who will freely receive it. And the fourth doctrine is this: the knowledge of God is an incomparable good. Knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human existence, an infinite good. Thus, a person who knows God, no matter how much he has suffered, can still say, "God is good to me." So, if Christianity is true, it's not at all improbable that suffering and evil should exist. In summary, for all these reasons, the probability version of the problem of evil is no more successful than the logical version. As a purely intellectual problem, then, the problem of evil does not disprove God's existence. But even if those intellectual arguments fail, the emotional problem of suffering and evil remains very powerful. If you have suffered deeply, or if you've watched someone you love go through intense pain, you may be thinking, so what if God exists? Why would I want to respond to him or worship him? I feel cold and empty and want nothing to do with him. You're not alone. God knows your name. He knows who you are and what you're going through. God promises to be with you through your suffering. He can give you the strength to endure. Jesus Christ also suffered. Although he was innocent, he was tortured and sentenced to death. His suffering had a purpose, to provide you and me with a life-giving connection to God. Not only does God exist, but He loves you. He seeks after you. He offers you hope. And in time, He will make all things new.
He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.
Let's take a look at the class schedule real quick, and this would just apply to those of you that are taking it here through Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Spurgeon College, so those of you taking it here in Nebraska with me. If you're just watching the lectures on your own or auditing the class, or those of you that are taking this in Germany, none of this will apply to you. But those of you taking it through Spurgeon College here with me in Nebraska, let's take a look at the class schedule, make sure we're on the same page. Tonight is March 4th, and I just gave a lecture here on the problem of evil. You had to read 4 chapters, chapter 7 in Frank Turek's book, chapter 14 and 15 in Thinking About God, and then chapter 2 in J.P. Moreland's book. Make sure you get your reading summaries emailed to me by tonight, midnight. And then next week, March 11th, is going to be a little bit different. You can see you got quite a bit of reading to do for next week. So the appendix, the first appendix in Turek's book, in Thinking About God, you have 17, 18, 19, 21, and 22. Pretty short chapters, but 5 of them. And then in J.P. Moreland's book, Love God with All Your Mind, chapter 3. Those reading summaries then will be due next week on March 11th. Now, also on March 11th, that night, sometime during that day, I will email all of you your midterm exam. And you might remember from the beginning of the semester how this is going to work. But on March 11th, I will email you your midterm exam, and then you'll have a week to complete it. It's open book, it's open note. You can use any resources you want. It's mostly going to be essay exams, essay questions. So basically, you'll be writing a bunch of short essays. You can use resources to do that, and you'll have a week to complete your midterm, and then you have to email it back to me. It's due the following week on March 18. So if you have any questions about the class, the assignments, the reading, the content that we're going through, please reach out to me, and I'm here to help.